Chapter 27. So this is love. Seeing Jessie with another woman had flipped a switch inside her, and somewhere between Half Moon Bay and her apartment, Adelina made a decision. She was proud of her virginity, mainly because she fought so hard to keep it. She hadn't remained celibate because she was a prude. She'd abstained because she didn't want to end up like so many of the women who'd come to the birthing center. All things considered, she found the risk-reward ratio of casual sex to be out of balance. On a strictly pragmatic level, it seemed the best way to keep her options open was to keep her legs closed. This frame of mind had saddled her with a reputation for modesty that was far from the peculiar truth. In fact, she was the mental polar opposite of a sexual goody two-shoes. Adelina Floribert de la Cruz had a vivid imagination, and she used it in most curious ways. Adelina lived out her sex life in erotica fantasy worlds. Her intimate revelries consisted of internet porn, randy romance novels, and the aforementioned imagination. What had begun as merely a physical release eventually evolved into a sensual ritual. By this time in her life, she'd become a veritable virtuoso at channeling a variety of sexual energies. Her practice was semi-ceremonial. Fridays, after work, she'd head to the local dispensary. Anyone who thought they knew her would have been stunned to learn she was an avid Rastafarian, weedily speaking. The supermarket magazine rack provided the necessary paperbacks. After selecting a title that most struck her fancy, she'd choose a wine to complement her imagined scenario. Red and dry if she were going dark, or light and fruity if the context were more whimsical. She removed her shoes and bra when she walked through the door. While drawing a bath, she'd light several aromatic candles and set Spotify to an easy listening instrumental station. After her bath, she'd wrap herself in a towel, sit on the side of the bed, and roll a blunt. When she'd found a suitable porn site, she'd mute the audio and play the images in the background while reading, toking, and sipping wine. She'd meticulously create the world her characters came from and the events that had brought them to their present situation. She gave them ambitions outside of the roles they played on the pages she was reading. She knew what they smelled like, the feel of sweat against their bodies. Slowly, organically, she'd bring the selected storyline to its logical climax. Sometimes, she talked out loud.
Non me lo aspettavo.
Did she love him? That wasn't the point. Sometimes you just want what you want when you want it. She wasn't going to wait any longer. She'd waited long enough. She waited to be chosen for the right circumstance, the right time. That must have been what people meant when they talked about ladies in waiting. Her mindset also wasn't at all what she'd expected. She'd always imagined her first time as a painting, passionately stroked from all the colors on love's palette. But driving home that night, she realized something. The only thing she'd really been waiting for was the right guy. He was surprised when he'd opened the door. She hadn't called. Without a word, she pressed herself against him, pulling his head down and rolling her tongue in his mouth. Jesse didn't try to make sense of it. He was more interested in the what than the why. When he eventually did try to speak, she placed a finger against his lips and shook her head. When she pushed him on the bed and stepped out of her coat, she was already naked. He was stupefied by the fantasy playing out in front of him. She was even more beautiful than he'd imagined. The aesthetics of her form gave him to understand that indeed, there is a God. Sweeping the pillows off the bed, she glanced around the trailer. No paperback vamp personality came immediately to mind as she watched Jesse fumble with his zipper. Things were moving so fast that he had trouble keeping up. He peeled his pants off and kicked them across the floor. She pushed him down and slowly laid on top of him. He was warm and solid, like the handle of a cast-iron skillet. She curled into him and softly suckled his tongue. Soon enough, his hand slid along her inner thigh and she rolled onto her back. Prickly tingles tinged the outer edges of her nerves as she opened her eyes and looked on his face. His eyes were closed, but she sensed he felt something beyond desire. She held her breath as he traced his fingers along the contours of her back. When he gently stroked the hair at the nape of her neck, she took a deep breath and nestled her face into his chest. He smelled like outdoors, funky and sweet. She slowly stretched on her back, and when she received him, the pain she'd been warned against proved no barrier to her acceptance. For her muse, she settled on the neophyte, determined huntress that she was. She closed her eyes and abandoned herself to the ebb and flow. The energy also wasn't at all what she'd imagined, notwithstanding all the imagining she'd done. Nothing she'd read or seen had in any way prepared her for the real thing. She'd seen a million people fuck. This wasn't that. His muffled, intermittent utterances gave her a feeling of power, while the strength of his arms around her made her feel small and protected. With his cheek molded into hers, Jesse settled into a steady, undulating, hypnotic rhythm. While suspended in the unfamiliar intoxication of the moment, the locomotion of his deft churning began to stir places in her she had known existed. He wasn't just penetrating her yoni. He was probing her soul. His grip suddenly tightened. When he abruptly sucked his breath, Adelina opened her eyes to the torturous grimace of love laying across his face. He grabbed her shoulders and she locked her legs around his hips and held on. His hands cupped beneath her hips and lifting her up, he propelled himself into every thought she'd ever again have. As he rolled onto his back, she laid on his chest. Lying in the sweet, funky darkness, feeling his chest rise and fall, she suddenly wanted to call her mother. Adelina had been right. Jesse'd gone to Half Moon Bay precisely because it was so far off the beaten path. He had indeed thought he wouldn't be seen. But contrary to what she'd believed, he wasn't involved in any secret affair or dalliance. The woman she'd seen with him had been none other than Dr. Omadera, and their meeting had been strictly business. While the president held Dr. Omadera in his closest confidence, if she had her way, the French, Germans, and Brits who lorded it over the Africans would all be speaking Lingala instead of the other way around. Dr. Omadera had been bitterly opposed to the Mugabe government that essentially restored Belgian rule to the Congo. She resented the United States of America because the CIA had been the primary facilitator of the Mugabe regime change that had killed Lumumba and installed another puppet government. While on the surface, she toted C Street's water. Her personal agenda ran 180 degrees counter to appearances. She lamented the fact that the nuclear weapons formerly held by South Africa had been dismantled by the outgoing government. But WMDs were a concern for another time. Right now, in order to ensure basic self-determination, communities needed to be able to defend themselves at the most basic level. That was the reason for the meeting with Hawk. There would be no division of North and Sub-Saharan Africans to the extent that she could help it. She was most intent on circumventing the United Nations treaty that decreed against any African nation, with the exception of South Africa, from manufacturing weapons. She'd approached Hawk after being alerted by MTC Egypt COINTEL agents who operated out of Torah Prison 992, who were associated with the church's prisoner outreach program. That initial meeting had led to Dr. Omadera's present concentration on Armscor, a South African weapons manufacturer headquartered in the Philippines. For decades, Armscor had supplied weapons to any African warlord or chieftain who could pay for them. Those people, in servitude to the illusion of power, had helped to continue white domination in their given areas of influence. Dr. Omadera was determined that those warlords, Armscor, and companies like them should pay for their troubles. The plan was simple. Flip the script. Whereas, historically, Weapons originating from European manufacturers had been used as tools of suppression. They would now be used as instruments of liberation. She'd been skeptical at first. She thought the logistics of delivering tons of weapons and ordnance to initiative recruits would be insurmountable. However, the simplicity of Hawk's response had both surprised and relieved her. We'll submit official UCC request appeals to Arms Corps, Raytheon, Boeing, Colt, etc. through their regular channels as always. We have people at every turn along the way. There's no reason for anyone to suspect anything out of the ordinary. By the time they catch on, we'll be armed to the teeth. Danny's operatives would handle the necessaries in Central America. One of the Latin objectives was to amass as many Hispanics at the California and Arizona borders as possible. They would serve as the unassailable reserves should they be needed in a ground assault. As long as they were on Mexican soil, UCC forces were powerless to do anything against them, theoretically. Because they didn't have access to official Central American military documents, they'd use the best counterfeiters in the federal prison system to create them. The Central American National Police and Army arsenals would serve as the main arteries through which the weapons would flow. They'd do what they'd always done. Arms would be shipped to, then siphoned from, National Police and Army stores, as usual. In order for Danny to be successful, the Central American gangs, officials, and others would certainly need to be paid. Where would the money come from? The Office of Engraving and Printing was responsible for printing paper money. Hawk would use them. Rather than have co-conspirators in the engraving department steal original currency plates or run extra batches of notes, Hawk chose instead to have other official documents printed. He'd use the official Treasury Department letterhead to order hundreds of billions of dollars in UCC banknotes from an outfit called Crane Currency. Headquartered in Dalton, Massachusetts, Crane is the official supplier of banknotes to many countries. To that end, the insurgents used the engraving department's unique attributes to also print orders for billions in currency notes for the Bank of Colombia. The notes would be printed at Crane's facilities in Haifa, Malta. But instead of being delivered to the client's respective central banks, Hawk arranged, for a fee, to accept delivery directly from the facility. As it pertained to arms, Hawk was especially concerned for telescoped, cased weapons. These lightweight, high-caliber machine guns with precision sights would provide the high degree of firepower, accuracy, and mobility required for the guerrilla tactics the operation called for. He focused on two makers of the weapons, Textron Systems, a manufacturer based in Providence, Rhode Island, and CTAI, a British-French joint venture based in Bourges, France. He determined to submit POs to the manufacturers of these weapons first. He'd get as many of these guns as he possibly could. The very idea of a self-determined Africa still felt like a dream. But Dr. Umadera was nothing if not passionate. For her, the operation wasn't merely political, it was personal. For as much as she despised the Brits and Christlanders, Dr. Umadera reserved her deepest loathing for the French. She hated them for enslaving the Vietnamese. She hated them for what they'd done in Haiti, Senegal, Morocco, Tunisia, Algiers, and Mali. She hated them for holding more than 70% of Muslim prisoners in French prisons. Her hatred of the French was most likely a simple personal preference, inasmuch as the British, under Rhodes, were arguably the worst African genocide offenders in history. But Dr. Umadera believed that ultimately all these atrocities would work to her advantage. The French Algerian Muslims and West African blacks who lived in the slums north of Paris were already active in the French Intifada. Recent events in which a 17-year-old black kid was killed by police during a routine traffic stop had rekindled old embers. They were sure to be critical assets when the time came. But Adelina Floribert de la Cruz didn't know about any of that when she dropped her bags in the back of the Beetle and left Camp Brown forever.